Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. This week, I would like to present another layout design video. Here is a plan of the customer's train room. It is a purpose-built outbuilding behind his home. And overall, it is 18.5 feet east to west by 14.5 feet north to south. There is an inward opening door flanked by two windows on one end wall. And there is an electrical panel in this corner. Now at the moment it's in slightly the wrong place. It turned out it was closer to the end wall. But that's one of the reasons why I always send the client a blank site plan just to make sure the dimensions are correct. Now with the client's want list, this turns out to be a very tight space indeed. So I will give fair warning to those of my viewers who dislike the amount of track that I sometimes am asked to cram into a layout design. If you really don't like to see layouts with such a high track density, then I'll give you fair warning now. Maybe just find a gardening video or something like that, and save the time you would have spent watching this one. But for the rest of you, welcome aboard. This promises to be quite an adventure. Now, the client wanted a long double-track main line. He wanted to run big steam and full-length passenger cars. So the absolute minimum sensible radius is about 30 inches. I've drawn in two double-track circles with 30 inches on the inside. Now, other than just a basic donut with a moving section across the door, the folded dog bone is pretty much the only sensible footprint in the space. Now, with allowing access to the electrical panel, obviously the one lobe has to be a little bit shorter than the other one. And it was a little unfortunate that the panel had to be in this corner. If it had been the other side of the room, we would have been able to have both helixes built with the uphill trains using the outside circuit. As it is, for right-hand running, they have to climb the inside track, which is of course slightly steeper. That's right, before we even started, it was known that it was going to be a multi-deck layout. The client had already seen a previous plan where I had two full scenic decks with staging above and below. And since he has a 10-foot ceiling, that certainly looked like it was going to be an option here. From early discussion, we decided that we were going to squeeze in the biggest staging yard we could fit on the bottom deck and then climb through two full scenic decks to more staging up in the rafters. And in addition to a full-service engine terminal with a 130-foot turntable and a 6-door roundhouse, full-service passenger terminal, freight facilities, industrial switching, mountainous running, and small towns, a large mine, and he wanted somewhere to put a tall double-track trestle, which he was in the process of building. He had already built a whole load of tall bents for it, although at that time he had yet to join them together into a completed trestle, so it was okay to go with either a straight or a curved configuration, depending on what fitted best. So quite a tall order for a space of this size. Now here is the first iteration of the lower staging deck. With the relatively short length of the room, it was always going to be necessary to wrap the staging yard around two sides, because by the time we got yard ladders at both ends, it really wouldn't have given a worthwhile length train. And then the rest of the lower deck I've earmarked for the trestle scene, because anyone who has designed multi-deck layouts before will realize that tall trestles really don't work well on anything other than the lowest deck of a multi-deck plan. So we can run part way around the room, gaining height all the time, so we end up with fewer laps in the helix up to the main deck. Now here I am blocking in space for various elements on the main deck. We're arriving up the helix in the northeast corner. With the shape of a steam era engine terminal, the inside of the helix is a good location for it, because it was likely to be the only place that we would have sufficient width. His passenger terminal has to be wrapped around the end of the room. It is unfortunate that we're going to have so much curved track in the passenger terminal. We talked about this fairly early on, and he was okay if he didn't get to do a lot of switching with full-length cars. Although I did manage to fix that to some extent in the final version. I will show you how I did that later. I wrapped a much smaller freight yard around inside the main lines. It's certainly not big enough to be a full division point yard. but it's sufficient for handling a few local freights to serve the various industries. And one of the other things that he wanted was continuous circuits so that he could just allow trains to run laps while he's switching. So I put a double track continuous loop here, hiding part of it under the helix so that it's not so obvious that the trains are chasing their tails. And I've shown where we can put a few holding loops. And although these holding loops are rather on the short side, they're better than nothing. And with the combination of the length of the site available and the minimum radius, it proved not possible to make this a full double track junction. We settled for the two parallel loops, being one through the main lines and one through the passenger terminal, and he was okay with that. We do at least have a universal connection from the front main to the back main here, and from the rear track of the passenger terminal all the way forward to the front track on the main end-to-end circuit, which continues up another helix to the upper deck. And of course, with the complexity of adding those double junctions in at both ends, we end up with multiple double slips in this area, because that was the only way we were going to get universal routing at this junction. And when I talked about that with the client, he was perfectly happy with the complexity of this area. His only concern was to make sure that I could indeed provide him with the track components for this area. So I assured him that yes, the number 8 double slip is available through my website. And of course, we were going to need 4 of them for this junction. In later plans, we ended up with a 5th one. Here is what I proposed for the upper deck. Now again, this is rather a high track density. I would like to have had less track on this level and more room for open scenery, but he wanted to get another continuous circuit in here. And with getting up to a high level staging yard, either we needed to wrap a grade twice around the room or accept a 3rd helix. And that would have been right at eye level in one of these 2 lobes, where it would have been right up in one's face when entering the room. It probably would not look as good as leaving the area open. So what I've done is wrap the main line around the room and back again through a small town, and there's a crossover here allowing those 2 laps to become a continuous loop, although by leaving this crossover straight, the entire length of the main line on this deck is part of a long end-to-end run. And then the back 2 tracks, which I've shown with a darker grey ballast, climbs up to the upper staging yard, which will be at approximately 84 to 85 inch elevation. So high enough to give full walk-under access into the train room and even to cross over the door if necessary. And then the sky deck would look something along these lines, with the main line crossing the aisle and staging loops wrapped around the back of the room with a reversing loop. I later removed this loop track and just joined it back up to the approach track so that the entire staging yard became a loop. It saves the need to waste one track as a thoroughfare. But I will get back into that later on during this video. So with the rough form of the plan sorted out, it's now time to start filling in details and just making sure that everything will fit. Here is the main deck with most of the turnouts drawn in. We can see the 4 double slips making this diamond junction with the 2 double track main lines, and the 5th double slip at this point giving access into the engine terminal, which I have not yet drawn out fully. I've just allowed space for it. And this area of the plan also shows an idea which was fairly short-lived. We have the passenger lead track wrapping all the way around and back on itself, forming a balloon track to turn passenger trains. It does kind of cut the engine service facilities in half, so we'd end up with the steam facilities inside the loop and the diesel facilities outside of it. And it would of course be a substandard radius. It would only be about 27.5 inch radius instead of 30, because it has to fit inside the standard minimum mainline radius curve. So for these and other reasons, we abandoned that idea. We decided that the lead track would be stub-ended. I've drawn 4 through tracks for the passenger terminal. Originally I was only expecting to put 3 in there with some stub tracks at either end. Now I've addressed the problem with switching passenger cars on curved track by making sure that the approaches at one end of the terminal are straight. And this is the same end that I've put the Railway Express Agency and the Post Office. So if he arranges his schedule so that he switches head-end cars at this end of the terminal, it avoids the problems with the curved track, because the rest of the train that is sitting on the curved area will not be switched. It'll just be this end. And then we have another lead track, which can extend off stage under the helix and be basically as long as he wants it to be. Now for the freight yard, we are limited to a fairly short lead track at one end, but it's still long enough to be able to switch locomotives, cabooses, and of course to add or delete short blocks of cars from through freight. All the main classification switching will be done from the other end of the yard, where we have a plenty long enough lead track. And by adding just a few inches of benchwork here, it can be extended all the way around to another industry in the corner by the electrical panel. Now in this plan, I increased the holding loops from 4 to 6 in this corner, but the front ones are really too short to be useful. So in later plans, I went back to 5 because that adds about an extra 3 feet to the front loop. And one mid-length holding loop off the inner main is probably more useful than 2 much shorter ones. Here is that same plan with some more details added. Here we see how I've gone back to a 5-track arrangement in this corner instead of 6. I've moved the benchwork edge as necessary and measured it at 29 inches at the minimum point, which is not too bad for a short restriction, bearing in mind we have this nice open area where his operators can congregate once they get through. I've also filled in the engine terminal. Now he did inform me that he had 2 extended tracks for the roundhouse, and I was hoping they were going to be together, but he tells me he extended the 2 end tracks, which is not the best way of doing it. The prototype would never do it that way if they had a chance, because not only is it more wall, but it's a less efficient use of the space inside. They would have extended 2 adjacent stalls. But that's the way he had it, and I had to work with it. He didn't want to start chopping it up, even though the back wall would be away from the viewer, and therefore an imperfect fit wouldn't necessarily matter too much. So in later plans, I had to make it look like it was planned that way. I've got 4 through tracks onto the turntable, 3 for servicing locomotives, and 1 direct track, which has access to all 4 of the passenger terminal tracks. The other turntable leads can only get to 2 of them directly. But it does have all the facilities necessary. It has a short track for sand and ash, a longer track for coal delivery. I wasn't able to get coal storage tracks in, but I have managed to include a short track for diesel fuel delivery and his machine shop that he wanted. And by doubling the length of the machine shop, we can use it as a backdrop to hide the access hole behind it. That way this area doesn't have to be covered, it can just be an opening, and it will not be visible from normal viewing angles. And then there's a 3-track diesel shop behind it, although one of the stalls has to be cut short, but that shouldn't be a problem. At this point, the industrial spurs are still just placeholders. I haven't designed that part in detail yet. What I wanted to do at this point was to make sure that everything we desired on this deck did indeed fit, because this is the key to the whole railroad. The various junctions on this deck are by far the most critical to fit into the space. Once this deck works, everything else should be fairly easy. And here is the lower deck, which of course is mostly a big staging yard. I managed to get in 12 tracks ranging from around 10 to 19 feet in length. And he asked for a change on the south side of the room. If you recall, originally the second main line just went around behind the scene. He felt it was desirable to have more visible main line, so he said just to have it pass through the scene twice, albeit at a much higher level. And here I'm showing the track above the staging yard. It turned out it's possible to put a junction in at the west end of the room. The central main lines continue to rise to the helix, while the 2 back tracks remain level and join up into a return loop. That gives him a 4th continuous circuit on the lower deck, so he can leave a train running continuously through his trestle scene. Down on this lower level, the continuous circuit is a long folded dog bone, so a train will run through this scene here 4 times, once on each of the 4 tracks. I later modified it slightly and moved this junction a few feet all the way to the end of the visible section. That made them slightly more accessible, and the extra few feet of length meant that this shelf could indeed be built level with a 2% riser for the main, rather than having to have one track rising and another falling. So it just makes construction easier at the cost of a few extra feet of track. Here I've got all the elevations filled in. Note that the helix is shown only as a placeholder, and it's drawn underneath the staging yard just so it doesn't obscure the turnouts. It is of course built above it, because the long main line from the staging yard 1.5 times around the room means that we've already gained half the height that we need to on this helix. So it's basically only a couple of laps to get up to the main deck. And all the hidden areas on this layout are laid out with Pico turnouts for economy, because although Pico turnouts are not the best looking, they are relatively inexpensive, as well as being readily available and reliable. So they are a great choice for staging yards and other hidden areas. All the visible portions of the layout are laid out with Fast Tracks turnouts. Now here are the elevations on the mezzanine level. Although the staging yard is at 24 inches, we've already gained a full foot by the time we enter the helix. And I've already scenicked the visible portion of this lower deck. His trestle can be on a 48-inch radius curve over a deep valley going all the way to the floor, with a truss bridge behind it, and another valley where we can use the long Walther's arch truss bridge, which is an excellent kit. So whereas the scenery can extend all the way to the floor around this portion of the scene, we do need to keep this part somewhat higher so that he can easily get underneath on a creeper into the access area. So of course this valley here is much shallower. When we talked about the structure for this area, we decided that we were going to put a leg in this location with a short tunnel. So I did redraw this level with that arrangement. I will show you that later in this video. Here is the main deck with all the structures and scenery filled in. I also drew in the industrial area along the north wall, and I ended up with one extra spur. We have 3 in this direction, 4 the other way. The middle track along here is mostly just a lead track for these 4 industries, although it does pass under the road bridge, and one of these structures in this corner could have a loading dock in the basement for an extra car spot. Now in this area around the helix, since we're using tall structures in the background, we don't need to go to the difficulty of curving the backdrop, especially around such a sharp curve, so I just made it with straight corners. It really doesn't make any difference. I've also added a few greenbelt areas just to break up the monotony of all the city structures, and where I've got the industrial branch crossing over the lower level main line, I was able to open out the curve radius somewhat. I think it ended up at about a 50-inch radius curve over the bridge, so it's not a problem for 2 short spans. And here we can also see how I have made use of the space between the 2 wings of the roundhouse, making it look as though it was planned that way. I put a back shot behind these 2 stalls, a powerhouse next to this one, and the 3rd stall of the roundhouse extends through the back wall into a short spur for delivering stores and powerhouse coal, although obviously not both at the same time, because there's only room for 1 car in there, and it's basically serving 2 separate industries. Because of course an engine terminal is basically several industries in one, giving lots of opportunities for switching freight cars. I already mentioned earlier the fuel delivery tracks, the sand and the ash collection. And here is another view of the main deck with all the elevations filled in. Now although most of the trackage on this deck can be level at 44 inches, it is necessary to drop the continuous circuit down 2 inches to pass under the helix, which of course at this point has already gained 2 inches from the base level. It would have been necessary to drop the main line here slightly anyway, because where the junction comes off, it is not yet fully clear of the helix below it. So that is something to keep in mind when designing a multi-deck layout. Where you come off a helix, the grade has to continue until it has completely left the helix area. So if you have another switching area above it, you do need to have the start of it on a grade. In this particular location, that is a benefit. It adds interest because the engine terminal trackage can still be level even though the main line is falling down in front of it. So we have some elevation change at this point, which of course helps to break up the flat look, which is often so prevalent on city areas of model railroads. Now at this point, the client was very happy with the bottom two decks, although he wasn't so convinced about the upper deck. And since he wanted to get busy constructing his railroad, he wanted me to supply him with the plans for the bottom two decks so that he could make a start on that while we worked out the issues with the upper deck. And since it's likely to be some time before he builds the upper deck anyway, rather than have all his trains terminate here, I designed him a temporary upper level, allowing the second helix to arrive at a temporary staging yard at upper deck height. It's not a big yard, it just needed to provide a reversing loop for sending trains back down towards the lower levels with a few holding tracks. Now he may never build this, but it just shows a way of getting around the problems only having the one scenic deck built instead of the two, and therefore makes building the upper deck less of a rush. And here's an interesting drawing that I sent him as well. Since he ordered all the fast track turnouts from me, I gave him a key as to which turnout goes where, or bright colours. Now here is the upper scenic deck. This is the version that we had available at this time. I told you the client wasn't particularly happy. He didn't really like this trestle running over the top of the small town. He did like the idea that I was able to get a couple of hidden holding loops in behind it. That allows him to have more than one train on this level at the same time, ready for entertaining himself or visitors if he just wants to run a train around the continuous loop. But as I said, the problem with this design is the long curved trestle over the town. And I don't necessarily like it either, but unless we're going to give up one of the two lobes on this level for another helix, it's going to be necessary either at this end or over the mine. At first he thought he might prefer it over the mine, so I did draw a version of the plan with that. Here it is. As we can see, the town is basically in the same place. The main change over this side is that the trestle has now gone, but of course now it has to reappear over the mine, and with the junction at a different place and the location of it, it meant that the mine had to be wrapped further around. So instead of having straight number 5 turnouts for the ladder, it now had to be fairly sharply curved. The curved ladder shouldn't be a problem, providing he only runs 2 bay hoppers, because with that case it would still be around 5 car lengths, which is considered the minimum for reliable operation of KD couplers. The 2 tracks labelled A connect up with the continuous loop via the holding tracks, and on this version they can be much longer because they can stretch halfway around the room under the scenery. And track B leads to the upper staging, so of course we approach that from the opposite end. The principal difference with this version being that only about a third of the continuous circuit is part of the end-to-end main line, from this junction here in the southwest corner to this one in the northeast. The rest of the run, around the back and around in front of the mine, is only used for the continuous circuit. It does not form part of the end-to-end main. Although that could be turned to an advantage by parking a couple of trains from a different railroad company in the holding loops and using it as an interchange. But eventually he concluded that he didn't like this plan. The trestle over the mine was going to be more obtrusive than over the town. So he asked me to go ahead and finish the original version of this deck. Here it is with all the structures drawn in. Now I'm envisioning this trestle sitting on masonry piers because they can just be straight parallel piers instead of tapered A-frames. So they can take up a lot less space and blend in more with the town, so hopefully being less obtrusive. We do need one complex post. We need a flying support at this point. Basically 2 pillars either side of the lower main line with a beam across between them, supporting the bridge deck. Even though it's a small town, I've tried to make the industries look big enough to justify rail service. And there is a team track and another industry along the front edge. This one is an ideal opportunity for a warehouse type industry being cut open, showing a full interior. And of course, at 64 inches, it is right at eye level. In order to hide this corner, we do need a fairly significant size mounting at this point, part of which has to be removable to give access to these two turnouts, although the other two are easily accessible, being right behind this access hole. And once again, there is a fairly big structure in front of it, hiding the fact that the road just disappears into the abyss. Here is that level with all the scenery drawn in. I added an extra stream winding its way around behind the town, and I found that it was possible to put a lake along the edge here because the helix below this track is far enough back from the benchwork edge to make that possible. This track along the back would be right up against the backdrop with a tree line in front of it, and around the west and south sides of the room, this track is right at the top of the scene, especially on the trestle, and I had to come up with an inventive way of supporting the upper deck in this area. I will talk about that later. And of course there is a big mountain right behind the mine, hiding the stand-up access space behind it. So there is of course no backdrop at this point. The cliffs around here will rise right up well above eye level through the sky staging deck and lighting valance above it. Now here is the first staging yard that I drew for this upper deck, and then I realized that it wasn't going to work in this location, so I redesigned it. I put a shorter ladder here. This is mostly number 6 Pico turnouts, although I did use some curved and some number 8s. There is only one track that has a reverse curve onto it, and that reverse curve is through a pair of number 8 turnouts. So even if he wants to put a passenger train in the second track with full-length cars, it's not going to be an issue. And then this end is all number 6s and curves. And here is a cross-section of the layout, the north wall and the south wall. This is what I talked about with the trestle being very close to the upper deck at this point. So rather than put conventional benchwork in there, I'm showing how there can be a higher level cantilever and just suspending it with screwed rods so that it doesn't wreck the viewing of what could otherwise be quite a spectacular scene. There is quite a lot going on in this view, so feel free to pause the video at this point. I'm assuming the use of the same adjustable shelving system that I have used on my own layout and discussed in previous videos, using mostly the 70-inch wall tracks and 19-inch brackets. The client has already built the benchwork for the lower level, so obviously he won't do it quite this way, but he can just put the wall tracks at the same height as on this side of the room, so they support the mezzanine and everything above it, and they'll just extend above the upper deck. So I think that is just about it for this layout design. Before signing off, let me just go and show you the full detailed versions one more time. Here is the lower staging level. Remember, the helix is just a placeholder. It's actually above the staging yard, not below it. And this is the original version of the mountain scene along the south wall. Here is the later version with the rocky ridge hiding a support post and the mezzanine level showing the rest of the continuous circuit. And here is the main level again, and the upper level, and here is the sky staging level one more time. So I'm just going to sign off for this week. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you again next time. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.